Hi, everybody. Thank you for getting up on Sunday morning. Thanks, Zeynep, for being here. Really happy to be here after hearing about Beirut, of course, but also Ashkal Alwan for years. It's very nice to be here. Particularly grateful to Zeynep for accepting to be in conversation with me without having ever met me before. So a few words of introduction. This is not an artist talk. I'm not going to show you any of my work. There's no images of my artworks that you will see during this presentation. I'm attempting to stage something that is more akin to the way I work. So I'm trying to go through a process of gathering ideas and images and issues. That is the process that I normally go through and from which I develop bodies of work. I'm quite self-conscious about it. I don't know how much it communicates. It's not a format I've ever done before. So we're just going to try it. So perhaps some of you know my work or a little bit about my work. I'm interested in conditions. So what I mean by that is, it's something that I call support structures or conditions, the how of how we work together. So I'm going through here a set of references. It's a bit like what Benjamin would call my library, which I have been revisiting according to different questions. A new question right now is the question of legacy, how things come to us. And I'm not talking about some obscure histories or blind spots. I'm not talking about minor histories. There are major references in the history of exhibition design, in the history of design, in the history of architecture, and things have been carrying along for a very long time. So some of them are researched very thoroughly, some of them are just rumors. There are things that I'm rereading according to a new set of issues. So these are things that are important to me because in some ways I'm indebted to them, meaning the legacy to me is a sort of tangible, temporal sense of how it is that I want to work. Then finally, something about the format. It's not exactly a conversation. I was interested in the idea of the commentary. So I'm talking about legacy, and legacy, cultural heritage, however you might want to call it, is the set of things that come to you that you have to interpret, you have to somehow do something with, or not, or discard. And my question to Zeynep, exactly because we never worked before, was whether she would comment on that. So there's two sets of readings that could actually take place during this presentation somehow. So we'll see how that works. Oops. No, sorry, I don't even know how to press play. Yeah. So you might recognize this woman. This is Hannah Arendt. But I don't want to talk about Hannah Arendt. I want to talk about Walter Benjamin, who in 1940, at the age of 48, committed suicide, you probably all know, in Portbou, at the French-Spanish border, while attempting to escape from invading Nazi forces. So he had, before setting up on his voyage, or do you want me to use that? Is that better? Before setting up on his voyage, he knew he might not make it to the other side. He gave his manuscripts, on the one hand, to Georges Bataille, who brought them to the National Library in Paris. And on the other hand, he gave a set of unpublished manuscripts to Hannah Arendt for her to carry to the US, where she was also escaping. He had really bad luck. He had a visa that his friends arranged for him. The border was closed just the night that he arrived. It was reopened the day after, but he was already dead. A few months later, we know that Hannah Arendt traveled exactly the same route, and she looked for his grave and was unable to locate it. She had his work, but she was looking for him, for his body somehow. And in a letter dated October 21st, 1940, she says, His grave was not to be found. His name was not written anywhere. No Walter Benjamin. She describes the cemetery facing the bay as by far one of the most fantastic and most beautiful spots I have ever seen in my life. We do have one account of somebody who was walking with Walter Benjamin, so you had to walk across this border. It was a woman called Lisa Fitko. Perhaps some of you know this. I'm just going to reiterate the story. So Lisa Fitko describes her encounter with the old Benjamin. Now, I mean, 48 is not that old, actually, so he must have looked much older than he was. And apparently he was not very fit, so he really struggled on this walk across the border. So she says, I saw that Benjamin carried a briefcase. It appeared to be heavy, and I asked if I could help him with it. And he said, it contains my new manuscript. And she asked, but why have you brought it along on this crazy trip? And he said, do you know, this briefcase is most important to me. I dare not lose it. The manuscript must be saved. It is more important than I am. It is more important than myself. The manuscript was lost and never found. Several days after arriving in New York, Hannah Arendt took the suitcase containing the manuscripts that she did have from Walter Benjamin to the office where Benjamin's friend Adorno and his colleagues had re-established a Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. They were supposed to publish this material. The writings, and particularly the thesis on the philosophy of history that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, constitutes today perhaps some of the main material that we know and are somehow indebted to Benjamin for. This had not been published at the time. But the way that the Frankfurt School, or the relocated Frankfurt School, the way that they dealt with the manuscript was really distressing to Hannah Arendt. And she wrote one on this subject: one will probably not ever be able to give the Institute members a lecture on the subject of loyalty to dead friends. She didn't really want them to have the manuscripts because she didn't think that they would treat them properly. And in fact, it was not until 1945 that any of these articles were actually published or appeared. And actually it was only in the journal. And Benjamin's work remained uncollected until 1955, so that's quite a long time, a decade. In 1968, Hannah Arendt, out of continued loyalty to her dead friend, she edited an English volume, which is actually what you see in there. She's like brandishing the book that she's been working on, which probably all of you know, Illuminations. She wrote an introduction for it. When she died in 1975, she was still working on Benjamin's legacy. She was working on a second volume, Reflections, that you probably also know, that was then finished by her literary executor. This is not a eulogy to Benjamin. It's the realization of how much of his fame, the fact that he's really considered one of the major thinkers of the 20th century, actually rested on the work that other people did in order to bring it to our present and to bring it to the future. A work that perhaps he would have been unable to do himself, perhaps unwilling to do himself. We won't exactly know, but we do have some account from the introduction to this volume, which I'd like to read a passage from. Like most puzzling to me, I've had this book for, 2 decades, and I'm a keen Hannah Arendt reader. I never read the introduction until a few months ago. So, she wonders why Benjamin was not more famous in his lifetime, why the recognition came after his death. I'm sorry, the subject is so heavy. It will get lighter eventually. She says, there is another less objective element than the mere fact of being unclassifiable, which is involved in the life of those who have won victory over death. It is the element of bad luck, and this factor, very prominent in Benjamin's life, cannot be ignored here because he himself, who probably never thought or dreamt about posthumous fame, was so extraordinarily aware of it. Thanks to the recent publication of his letters, the story of Benjamin's life may now be sketched in broad outline, she says in 1968. And it would be tempting indeed to tell it as a sequence of such piles of debris, since there is hardly any question that he himself viewed it in that way. but the point of the matter is that he knew very well of the mysterious interplay, the place at which weakness and genius coincide, which he so masterfully diagnosed in Proust. For he was, of course, also speaking about himself when in complete agreement. He quoted what Jacques Rivière had said about Proust. He died of the same inexperience that permitted him to write his works. He died of ignorance, because he did not know how to make a fire or open a window. Like Proust, Benjamin was wholly incapable of changing his life's conditions, even when they were about to crush him. With a precision suggesting a sleepwalker, his clumsiness invariably guided him to the very center of misfortune, or wherever something of the sort might lurk. Thus, in the winter of 1939 to 1940, the danger of bombing made them decide to leave Paris for a safer place. But no bomb was ever dropped on Paris, but Meaux, where Benjamin did go, was actually a troop center, probably one of the very few places in France that was seriously endangered in those months of the phony war. But like Proust, he had every reason to bless the curse and to repeat the strange prayer at the end of the folk poem with which he closes his childhood memoir, which I cannot read in German, so I will read it in English, which is pretty scary, and reads like this: "Oh dear child, I beg of you, pray for the little hunchback too." So apparently he sort of called himself a hunchback. Okay, last quote from this book. Scholem is surely right when he says that next to Proust, Benjamin felt the closest personal affinity with Kafka amongst contemporary authors. And undoubtedly Benjamin had the field of ruins and the disaster area of his own work in mind when he wrote that an understanding of Kafka's production involves, amongst other things, the simple recognition that he was a failure. What Benjamin said of Kafka with such unique aptness applies to himself as well. The circumstances of his failure are multifarious. One is tempted to say, once he was certain of eventual failure, everything worked out for him en route, as in a dream. He did not need to read Kafka to think like Kafka. When The Stoker was all he had read of Kafka, he had already quoted Goethe's statement about hope in his essay on elective affinities. Hope passed over their heads like a star that falls from the sky. On this subject. Okay. But Hannah Arendt's legacy, this one. Hannah Arendt's legacy also rested on other people, of course. She was, unlike Benjamin, very active in publishing and taking care of her own career. But she died while, you probably know, she was in the middle of writing the first tome of a 3-volume major work that remained unfinished. But the first volume was called The Life of the Mind. It was published after she died in 1978 and taken care of by her literary executioner. Is that what it's called? Yeah. That sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it? Mary McCarthy. What is it called? Executor? Executor. Yeah, executioner. Spell check. I'll blame it on the spell check. Mary McCarthy had been in dialogue with her for 25 years. Their letters have been published. They said of each other that they did not think alike, but they did the thinking business for and with each other, meaning they read each other throughout their entire life. Their letters are quite amazing, very recommended read. They say something about the practice of friendship in a sort of serious way, and its relationship to work that I think is particularly relevant. So in the postface of The Life of the Mind of 1978, Mary McCarthy gives us like some clues of what it means to actually take care of somebody's legacy. She writes, "She's not here now to consult or appeal to," talking about Hannah Arendt. "I have been forced to guess her reactions to every act of editorial interference. In most cases, previous experience has made that easy. If she knew me, I knew her. But here and there problems have come up which in the past I would surely not have attempted to solve on my own by guesswork. Whenever I was unsure, I would pepper a manuscript with question marks meaning, what do you want to say here? Can you clarify? Today, those points of interrogation, what do you suppose she means by that? Does she intend this repetition or not? Are somehow not, well, they're leveled at me, yet not in my own person exactly. Rather, I put myself in her place, turn into a sort of mind reader or medium. With eyes closed, I am talking to quite a lively ghost. She has haunted me, given pause to my pencil, caused erasures and re-erasures. In practice, this newfound freedom that has meant that I feel less free with her typescript than when she was around. And this, maybe some of you have seen this place before. It's a very modest grave next to her husband, Benjamin Butler, which is actually on the campus of Bard College, where she taught for a long time, and she said she was most happy, which is why she chose to be buried there. Okay. Okay, this is my last death slide. Then I changed the subject. This is a very beautiful quote, I think, that Hannah Arendt uses as the sort of linchpin, the point at which she articulates an entire book called Between Past and Future. It's actually a quote from a poet called René Char, from a book he wrote called Feuillet d'Hypnose, which was only published in 1946, but actually was written between 1943 and 1944 while he was in the resistance in France. It's like a book of fragments. They're almost all aphorisms. He says, partly because he just didn't have time to write, right? He was engaged in a sort of daily struggle, a daily fight, so he would just jot down these notes, and he survived the war, and when Heidegger went to France for the first time in 1955, before he went, he wrote to his friend Jean Beaufret saying that he wanted to meet two people while in France. There were only two people he wanted to see. One was Georges Braque, the painter, and the other one was René Char. So this was his first time in France, and the trip was entirely prepared by his friend. He did meet René Char for dinner. They did not have a language in common. Heidegger did not speak French. René Char did not speak German. But somehow there are notes taken onto what the conversation was in the shadow of a, it's like a very specific tree that he then talks about. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. René Char's words were registered as such. He told Heidegger, "The poet does not have memory. What is asked of him is to go forward." I mean, this is said by somebody who published the Feuillet d'Hypnose specifically because he wanted to remind France or the French people what it meant to live in a period of inhumanity. He felt that after the war, the French had already started to forget what they had actually gone through. The Hannah Arendt text that uses this sentence, I mean, what does she mean by that? What does he mean by that? This idea of a testament, this kind of instructions that would allow us to read the past into a future. In the gap between past and future, which is what she articulates, she talks about this question of being faced with the stuff that comes to you and not necessarily knowing what to do with it. The absence of a testament is also the absence of a sort of tradition that might name things or classify, that hands them down, that tells you how they could be used, what to do with them, which indicates what the treasures, what this inheritance might be, and what you could actually do with it. This break, the fact that the testament is missing, means that there is a break between past and future. There's a break in continuity at which we place ourselves and have to make it up as we go along, right? So the inheritance has to be read over and over and over again in order to make sense for a possible future.
So early on in a conversation that Céline and I were having, well, not early on, actually, later on, we were talking through some of these examples, and she said a lot of these ideas go back to friendship. So I wrote an essay in 2012 about friendship, which I want to send to you. And I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from that essay now, in your voice. If we were to engage in the work of friendship, this could lead to what Arendt recalls in our friend Mary McCarthy. It's not that we think so much alike, but that we do this thinking business for and with each other. The thinking business is work in friendship, and friendship in work. That's one quote. There is in Hannah Arendt a concept of culture that is, to my view, close to what I would call friendship as outlined above. She defines it as the company that one chooses to keep in the present as well as in the past. She quotes Cicero saying, he'd rather go astray with Plato than hold the truth with Pythagoras. What he means by this, I imagine, I quote Céline, is that he prefers the company of Plato than a so-called truth, especially if proclaimed by a bore like Pythagoras. The politics of such a judgment are of an alliance of whom one would rather be with. So that's the second quote. And the last one I'd like to read is, friendship, like support, is considered here as an essentially political relationship, one of allegiance and responsibility. Being a friend entails a commitment, a decision, and encompasses the implied positionings that any activity in culture entails.
Is this still on? Yeah. Having my own work read to me. Okay, so this is a completely different story. Gil Sans. Some of you, I suppose, have used this font or are familiar with it. You know, it was designed by Eric Gill. He was a British artist, sculptor, typographer who, I think he lived, 1882 to 1940. In 1907, he decided to leave London and establish himself into a small village in Wales. And he established a sort of commune there. A lot of artists and thinkers followed him there. His commune was entirely based around him as a figure. He was sort of guru-like, apparently. Very charismatic person. He's also very, the word that comes is dubious, but I think controversial is the official way that he's defined. His well-known extremely religious views and subject matter generally viewed as being at odds with his famous sexual behavior, including his abuse of his daughters, which has been written about quite extensively. In fact, there's one of his historians called McCarthy, weirdly, says that she has watched in dismay as the fact of Gil's abuse of his daughters has grown to become the thing that defines him, as if it could be otherwise. The reason why I'm showing this is that through the conversations with Zeynep, there was a really big question that came up as to which references and why do you keep them? Why are there some things that stay in your baggage, in your library, as Benjamin would say? The things that you keep talking about, and what are the things that you might discard? I do not use Gil Sans in my work, ever. I try to avoid it at all costs. So this is just a story as an example of how the individual choices, the political responsibility of people behind some of the stuff that we use, I think is completely inseparable from the work as it is today. Do you have something to say?
I can start off actually. So actually, like one of the things that kept coming up in our conversations, we kept going back to the same questions over and over again, actually, or rather, I was posing to Céline, why choose these examples? So she's going through a series of examples, and she always kept coming back with a question in response. So some of those questions I jotted down, and I want to bring them up right now as we go along. So one of the first ones, and I think that's the most crucial one here, is who are the interlocutors that you converse with and converse through. And that's something that was really interesting to me, that difference between with and through. thinking with someone versus thinking through someone is an interesting thing, because either someone is there, flesh and blood, and talking to you, or they're long gone, or you've never met them, or they're geographically or time-wise distant from you, one way or another. But then you can actually have someone, flesh and blood, be next to you, but you can be thinking, not thinking with them, but thinking through them. As in, if you're actually building two separate projects together, building two separate sand dunes is the thing that comes to my mind. Together, they're gonna have different shapes, but they're gonna be influenced by one another, but you can be thinking through those things separately through each other, but not with one another. So that's actually something that I kept posing to Céline. Which of these examples are examples of with, and which of these examples are through? And then the second question that kept coming up, and I think that's, I'm just going to restate it, because Céline just put it very succinctly just right now, is at what point is an interlocutor not an interlocutor anymore, but becomes someone that is not acceptable? There's a threshold through which, over which you have to go, that their ideas are not acceptable, and they're not somehow of use to you, and what's that threshold for each and every person? And I think that's the filter through which you view the world and through which you work, and it's very important to identify it. So that's something else that we talked about a lot.
Which brings me to Herbert Bayer. So maybe, again, some of you are probably familiar with this drawing. It's really not obscure. It's, if you've ever been interested in the Bauhaus or in the history of exhibition design, this would have appeared over and over again. I first encountered it in a book by Marian Staniewski called The Power of Display. I'm really interested in conditions, hence my interest in display and somehow exhibition display particularly. So this is a page from the book. It's in black and white. It's called Diagram of Field of Visions. He called it Expanded Fields of Visions. He made it in 1930 as he was working on the Werkbund exhibition in Paris with his colleagues from the Bauhaus. So that, not this drawing, but the exhibition was produced in collaboration with Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. A few years later, he wrote Fundamentals of Exhibition Design. He eventually left Germany, went to the United States, became extremely recognized, was one of the main designers for exhibitions at MoMA, so you might have heard of the exhibitions he staged there, including a Bauhaus exhibition, and some extremely ideological exhibitions, let's say, also. I've been working with this for a really long time. It's one of the things I talk about with my students, influenced me in exhibitions that I made. I like it a lot. And it's only about a year and a half ago that I found out, as I found the actual drawing, which I will tell you how I found it, I found out that before he left Germany, Herbert Bayer had actually worked for National Socialism quite extensively. He did a whole series of graphic works, posters, publications, pamphlets for highly ideological Nazi exhibitions for the German youth, and, you know, like basically employed by one of the worst chapters of 20th century history, a fact that he carefully omitted from his own archive at Aspen, right? So there's none of this material that is in his archive at Aspen. But one of his friends, Joseph Albers, after his death, sent the letters that he had received from Bayer before him going to the United States, that therefore implicate him. There are letters in which he actually describes his work, and it's only recently that these letters have been added to the Bayer archive. So I'd been talking about this guy for like a decade, and then I find out that he was, as people say about Heidegger, a little bit of a Nazi. So, and I decided that, well, I decided I was not going to throw this away, that I was going to keep talking about it. But that's when this whole question of legacy kind of opened up for me. So how do I deal with it? You know, how do we deal with it? It's easy to say, like Eric Gill, that's beyond, that's the threshold that I can't stand. I will never talk about it again. And I thought perhaps it is interesting to start asking questions to this work and see how we can actually acknowledge its problematics while keeping it into the present. Of course, it means rereading it and opening that up. So this happened as I was also doing research about a completely different person, somebody called Elaine Lustig-Cohen, who was a painter and graphic designer based in New York. This drawing was in her kitchen. This is like an old lady who died last year. She had worked on the graphic design of his book. He had given it to her. So I found the original drawing, which I think had not been seen since the 50s, at the same time as I found the problems around that work. So this is why these images are actually photographs from an exhibition that I did in New York. So I'm showing this work and I'm trying to frame it, right? That's the thing that I can do. I can actually frame it. And the frame is partly the set of questions on legacy. So I think looking at it again, there are other exclusions that are in the work that perhaps I didn't see before. Like, for instance, maybe clear to you, this body of a spectator who's looking at these expanded fields of vision is very still. He's a man, he's white. He's not a body exactly, he's just a gigantic eye that is looking at the material given to him. More than a spectator, he's a viewer, he's incredibly passive, right? This idea, I think, defines a notion of an ideal audience to exhibitions that is really dominant throughout the second half of the 20th century, right? This well-educated, well-behaved, silent audience that should move through museums and look at things from a distance, not getting too close, not making any noise, not resting or sitting down, right? So the exclusion of the body and its needs for instance, a place to rest or some warmth are something that I'm able to read in it now that I didn't used to be able to before, which means that despite its sort of radical surface, I think the Herbert Bayer drawing also is inherently conservative in some of its definitions. I mean, this passive spectator instead of an active one, this is exactly not how he talked about it. But the real question for me remains, how do we approach the intellectual work of those that we might honor or admire, but who have done things that are not okay with us, that are not acceptable to us, who have had political views that we might despise? How do you deal with that work? How do you carry it into the future? How do you talk about it to your students? I'm not aiming at a critique of Bayer per se. He's just a very good entry into this question. I'm aiming at a clarification of how to approach his work, like how to approach many people's work, including living, the flesh and bones that Zeynep is talking about, people who surround me who might do things that I actually intimately disagree with. Bayer's an example. He's an example and a sort of entry into this question of the after. Yeah? What comes after? What's the legacy?
Yeah, and to take on from that, like that's the question that comes up from there on for me is if you're interlocuting with someone, you're building a network of interlocutors in order to build an infrastructure that's there, that's supposed to, like, you're building towards a sustainable infrastructure. But when the context changes, when there are certain givens that you find out about, the infrastructure is supposed to shift in perspective as well. And at what point does that, how do you keep on building that infrastructure? And that's something I will come back to, but that's sort of a question that sort of arises from the change of the how you interlocute with your reference.
Another really old reference for me, something I really love. It's called the Silk and Velvet Cafe. It was designed by Lili Reich with Mies van der Rohe in 1927 for the International Exhibition in Berlin. With Mies van der Rohe, meaning he was somehow her assistant, helped her out. We don't exactly know. There were a couple at the time, and even though this actually had quite a big impact, the reason why this image looks like this is because, of course, we only have black and white images of it, even though apparently this cafe was entirely cloaked in these gigantic curtains in silk and velvet that were black, purple, orange, and yellow. So it must have been a really opulent, kind of luxurious space. It's one of two images of her work that are at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, but not in her own archive. They're actually in the Mies van der Rohe archive. Why? Because, so Lili Reich and Mies van der Rohe were a couple. At some point in the early 30s, Mies was really advised that he should leave Germany. You know, there's another sort of very similar context to the one that Bayer was actually living in. And he was advised to leave, and Lili Reich decided to stay behind to take care of their things, including the work, her studio, the archive. She was much more famous than he was at the time. But Mies proceeded to become Mies van der Rohe, perhaps one of the most, I don't know, famous architects of the 20th century. I mean, is that fair enough? Yes, definitely with his work in the US, right? And she stayed behind, became increasingly implicated in a really problematic situation. The studio burnt down with all the work in it. The only thing that we have left of Lili Reich's work is what Mies had taken in a suitcase with him, which is why her archive does not exist but appears inside his own. So there's another question of legacy here. That's not super easy to extricate, let's say.
So I worked on a project called Apricots from Damascus that Dilek Winchester, an artist, invited me to. That was in Salt a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago. And for that research, I looked into the Heimat laws in Turkey, which is basically when the Turkish Republic was founded in 1923. Heimat laws in German literally means without a nation. When the Republic was founded, they decided to go ahead and find a university system. And the university reform took place in 1933. A lot of the people, even before 1933, in the 20s, Germany and Turkey were allies in the World War, and so a lot of German professors were already coming to Turkey to teach at the Ankara University, which had been founded. But in 1933, actually a lot of German Jewish professors who were escaping from the National Socialism that was going on in Germany, came to Istanbul and started teaching at the Istanbul University that just got founded in 1933 with the university reform. The thing with the university reform is that it got rid of the old university system in Turkey, which basically was the medrese system, like the religious system, and the official secular universities were being founded. So basically with the Istanbul University, 2/3 of the old faculty were let go of, so they were in need of a lot of new professors and teachers, so they accepted a lot of the German Jewish. Whereas the Ankara University, Ankara being the capital of the newly founded republic, was actually had a lot of the German professors also, but those that were associated with the German government that was going on at that time. So there's the Heimat laws is actually used for the German Jewish professors who came to Turkey. It's literally written as Haymatloz, so it's a Turkification of the German word, and it's specifically for the academics. And there's a huge research done in the areas of art history and architecture, what the influence was on those two fields, but not so much with other fields. So, and I'll tell you the research of one professor who did the research in the agricultural field, actually. But maybe I'll finish that and let you go and finish off. And Sevtap Kadıoğlu is the professor that I'm thinking of, who's living right now and working in Istanbul University. And she looked into the agricultural department's foundations in those two universities at the time. And basically, Ankara University's agricultural department got founded in 1933 with all the German government employees. And the Istanbul University agricultural department got founded by all the German Jewish. And the two of them never interacted with one another, but these are the two universities that actually set up all of the agricultural system in Turkey at the time. So we owe all of the infrastructure to these two schools, but what happened is that at the end, as we faded away out of the collaboration, that Germany and Turkey sort of separated and went their way. The Ankara University's influence totally faded away, and it's actually the Istanbul University's professors that set up the whole structure. But somewhere in there, there was actually the Ankara University that was already setting up the infrastructure. So the the agricultural system, we totally owe to the Heimatlos that were in the Istanbul University at the time, at the end of the day.
This is the last story. It's the story of E1027, a house designed by Eileen Gray in the south of France, close to Monaco, in Roquebrune. I went twice. I went in 1999, which is where this picture's from, and I went again in 2014. Eileen Gray has become one of the most, perhaps, like recognizable designers, especially for her furniture. She is now famous for having had one of her chairs be the most expensive piece of furniture of the 20th century, which was in the collection of Yves Saint Laurent and sold for, I believe, $42 million at auction. Obviously, none of this happened while she was alive. She was not particularly rich when she died. She only did 2 buildings, this one, E1027, and another house called Tempapaya, which is just around the corner. Well, you can't see the house right now, but she designed, so 1926 to 1929, with her partner at the time, Jean Badovici. While staying as a guest in the house in 1939, Le Corbusier, when she was not around, Le Corbusier, very famous figure, painted bright murals on the white walls, and is famous because there are some images of it for apparently painting them in the nude. Eileen Gray was, of course, incredibly furious, and she left the house never to spend any time there again. Le Corbusier became intricately tied to the future of the house. He tried to buy it when it went on auction, did not manage. He eventually bought a plot of land just over it. So this is the house. He bought a plot of land just there where he built his summer house, which therefore was overlooking Eileen Gray's house and removing any possible privacy. I mean, this is like an incredibly beautiful, secluded spot. It's not like this anymore, of course, but this would have been like this sort of idyllic summer house. So he built this little cabin called Le Cabanon, which you can go and visit. It's actually quite an interesting little building just over it. And Eileen Gray never stayed there again. I mean, why is this house so important? Just a few words for those of you who don't know it. So she designed the exterior and the interior entirely. Every piece of furniture, every door handle, the way that the mirror reflects the light in the morning sun, etc. These are some of her drawings that I think are really beautiful. This table that you've probably seen multiple editions of was designed as a breakfast table so that you could actually be in bed and the table slides under the bed. There's incredible attention to detail and very, very much against some of the ideology that Le Corbusier was promoting. This is not a machine to live in. This is about having comfort and pleasure in every single moment of your life. Now, what is the legacy here? I mean, the legacy question for me here is that, of course, when I went in 1999, as you can see, the house was in ruins. It had been squatted for years. She was not famous enough, Eileen Gray was not famous enough to have a foundation in her name, which she now does, which meant that the house was totally falling into disrepair, while the murals belonging to Le Corbusier, the Le Corbusier Foundation is extremely important, very wealthy, very established in Paris, kept maintaining the frescoes while the house was falling around, because they have a completely different legal status. They were considered national heritage, and the house, nobody wanted the house. The house was even offered to the Irish government because she was Irish, and they refused to purchase it for 1 franc at the time. So this is before she became famous, of course. So that's what these images are, right? This inseparable futures and legacies of these two people's work, who are now somehow both equally famous, but one's work literally destroyed the other's work. What do you do with that? I am not entirely sure. The house has now been restored. There is actually a fund that was, I think, partly funded by the Getty, actually, which was used to restore the building and make replicas of the furniture. So I think you can just visit it if you ever go to the south of France. It's a very beautiful spot. Another detail, or odd detail, Le Corbusier died drowned in front of this house in 1974. Okay, so this is the end of where we're at. I don't know what I should say. Maybe something about the commentary. I'd be really interested in having any questions or comments coming from you guys, of course. As I said, this is just like a growing collection of things that I'm sort of trying to revisit. I'm not totally sure how much of it was familiar or not. Yeah, if you have any questions.
We can open it up for questions.
Doesn't matter how trivial.
Or no questions.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I was thinking about the responsibility of representation you were talking about. Also because it's something I'm really concerned about myself, and I just recently got across a very kind of radical approach to it from Sarah Ahmed, who's in her recent book is not quoting any white man throughout the whole book. And yeah, I saw that kind of as, for example, a strategy to answer this, like how to take responsibility in representing. And you raised that question, and I was thinking, did you think of any kind of action towards how to do it? For example, instead of just saying I'm not, because you did talk about Heidegger and so on. So how can we actually act?
I mean, I'm not an expert in ethics or historical justice. I should just say, I think part of the motivation for presenting this series was to try and expose the series of personal choices that we make all the time in relationship to the things that speak to us, that are important to us, that are dear to us, perhaps, and those things that we decide to discard along the way for whatever reason, because it doesn't speak to you, or because you don't like that person, or because it's a white man, or whatever it might be. And I think those choices are inherently political. Yeah, they're choices, judgments made onto, going back to, I think, Hannah Arendt's definition of culture, how culture is made out of those choices that we make all the time and the company that we choose to keep. The company we choose to keep, of course, is the company we also choose not to keep, right? The fact that Pythagoras might have been so incredibly boring that Cicero did not want to stay with his thinking, like a sort of ancient example that is incredibly clear in terms of where those choices might lie, that might be just like personal taste as well, and that is also apolitics. I think that knowing what we know today, perhaps differently to how somebody might have read Herbert Bayer 50 years ago, I think it is inherently your responsibility, my responsibility, everybody's responsibility to keep working with those people who deserve attention and try and discard those people who perhaps did not deserve all of that attention, or that you might disagree with. I mean, we were laughing about it yesterday, that art history loves assholes. It really does. There's a crazy number of people that are despicable in terms of their own lives, but you know, who is it that keeps talking to them? I teach, you know, so I think that part of my role as a teacher is also to promote certain things over others, of course, partly because I think they're more interesting, but also partly because I think things have to be wrenched out of the sort of miasma of history in order to speak to people. And storytelling is one of those ways of doing it. It's a sort of side answer to your question, I think.
Do you want to talk about the Carl Andre example?
You want to talk about the Carl Andre example?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, talking about teaching, this is something that came up like early on, that was like, how can you not talk about Carl Andre when you're talking about minimalism? You can't escape it, but how can you not talk about Carl Andre without mentioning Ana Mendieta and telling about the possible rumor of a story without it, if you're in a condition, like if you're in a position to actually acknowledge that. And that's where I made the comment, and I don't know if we agreed or not, but it's kind of like this, this thing about omission, and still showing, because early on, when I didn't understand what Céline was talking about, I was like, why are you still showing the buyer? Can you replace it with something? As opposed to showing buyer, can you just, is there someone whose ideas are important in there that you could replace it with? But she was like, well, actually, that is an important part of my intellectual history, so I want to present it, but I want to present it in a frame. So, which is my, okay, I get what you're thinking about point. Which is when I said, like, it's almost like you have a chain and there's a really broken chain, and you don't want to remove it and replace it, but you want to like shine it or build like another chain around it so that like you do spotlight what's wrong with that little link there, but you do keep on using the chain nonetheless, because it's been overused and it's there and there's a point in it.
I mean, there's a condemnation there as well, right? Because Mendieta's name then only comes up in relationship to Carl Andre. And we'd also want to free her of it a little bit. I've tried both strategies. Sometimes I never mention Carl Andre. Like, I can teach for a whole year without mentioning his name. It's not that difficult. You can do it. And sometimes I do. But I do mention Mendieta.
Yeah. On her own, or?
Yeah, I've had different problems. If we're talking about this, you know, there's like always different layers of problems. My new problem is that I teach in Italy. I make these like intricate bibliographies for my students. I really try and make them as diverse as possible, including people who might be speaking from different points of view, different places in the world, etc. Okay, major issue. Most of the material is English. It's in English because it has either been written in the United States or has been published in English. You know, the American feminists were a lot more prolific than the Italian feminists. So my students are constantly subjected to voices that come from elsewhere. And what does it do is that long term, they think they don't stand a chance because they don't come from there. They don't come from Bard. They don't come from those schools. So that's a new problem I have that I'm not entirely sure how to deal with.
Having seen the photo of the drawing in the exhibition that you made, I was just curious how you framed it. Like, what was the idea behind that presentation? Because it looked like there was a part taken off from a purpose-built wall.
Yeah, I mean, the framing, right, as being important. So that's another way of commenting on the work that I thought was important. So I used the drawing as somehow the center of the exhibition. Each piece responds to this idea of legacy in a different way. So I thought that cutting a hole in the wall is a way of exposing existing conditions. Right, the stuff that is not necessarily that pretty, it's definitely not the white cube, right? It's through the white cube and exposes the history of the place and the sort of nitty-gritty of what comes behind it. It's very didactic, you know, like once you're faced with that, you see it in a slightly different way. There's that sort of rather ugly pipe going through it. It's hung very precisely, it's all very straight, of course, but I thought I could not hang it on the same walls that all of the rest of the work is, and therefore make it a focus, because it also relates to all the stuff that happened before in the space. But this is a particular context. This was at P exclamation mark, a little gallery in New York on Broome Street. And Prem Krishnamurti, the curator, director, whatever, also director of projects, who designed the website for the Sharjah Biennial and Tamavij. He invited me to do an exhibition, and I asked to be the last show. I always wanted to be the last show because I wanted to uncover some of the layers of the making of the space. So through this uncovering of existing conditions, then I can talk about Herbert Bayer through a frame that I think is more suitable to exposing its problematics. I think, some people get it, some people don't get it. That's okay. There were a series of events happening once a week, talking about legacy. This was the sort of staging I chose. I'm working on a new show with this drawing, which I feel incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to borrow, right? Also, the fact that I found it and I know that I can use it, I can address it directly for a few months, also means that I'm just articulating this entire project on legacy around that drawing.
Yeah, thank you.
Ryan had a question, and I don't know about time, so maybe Betul, you can cut us off when you want to.
Thanks for your discussion. I guess your presentation kind of it got me thinking about augmentation instead of, I don't know, so I was kind of thinking about the way you frame this and how it seems to be kind of like an extraction or kind of a deconstruction. But I've been lately really thinking about, things that are already out there and people that are already recognized, but then kind of adding to it, right? So like recognizing or marking the limit, to which they kind of take you, and then to kind of see where other people also might be able to take you further, right? So sometimes these people are not as well known. So I guess that I was wondering if you also have been thinking about authorship, because I've been thinking a lot about how authorship is not a singular event, or it's not an individual kind of thing. So I was wondering if you might, if this has crossed your mind, if you could say something kind of about that and how you're kind of exploring that in your work.
Yeah, thank you. That's very relevant to me, actually. I try to work cumulatively. This is one of the strategies I have to undo some of the problems with authorship that you highlight, but also some of the tendencies we have to oversimplify things when we make exhibitions. Yeah, so much of making exhibitions is removing. Yeah, like the incredible work and care that we all know about that goes into making a space white and clean for the next person to come in and show, right? All that erasure and protection is like just that. I've worked quite a lot with just, what happens if you don't do that? But if you allow people to work on top of other people, on top of other people, on top of other people, which means, of course, that you're not entirely in control of what something might look like, but then you're able to add complexity that you could never do by yourself. None of what I've shown today is about that, but I think, it's a strategy or a tactic. I'm not actually sure entirely what it is. It's definitely a methodology that I think is very effective in this idea of reading things anew. I can't work on top of the Herbert Bayer, but that would have probably been a good way of dealing with it. You alter it while retaining its history, its narrative, by just somehow adding things to it. From my experience as an artist, complicated authorships are not very welcome. Yeah, the entire art system is built on the idea of individuals saying things. That's another reason why the project on legacy is so dear to me. Yeah, the fact that Benjamin's reputation rests on somebody like Hannah Arendt or Adorno, and that we don't necessarily think about, that none of these people worked on their own, but they all worked with interlocutors, but also through the voices of other people who took care of their work, right? That, I think, can be translated in this idea of cumulative work somehow. None of us start from scratch, whether we're artists or writers, we all know this. But the tradition wants that if you're a writer, other people's voices gets relegated to the bottom of the page, written really small into the footnotes, right? That's where you put the friends. If you're an artist, tradition wants that the other people's voices are either friends, so they remain in the domain of the personal, or they're your assistants, right, who are unnamed. It's only the structure of work in film that actually names everybody who participates. In art, you don't usually name technicians or assistants or whatever that might be. I kind of try and tackle this in different ways. Like, I've got this really elaborate credit system, which means that when I do a show, I usually try and credit everyone who's been part of the making of the show, but you don't really know where to stop. Sometimes those lists have hundreds of people, sometimes they have 4. But I think they're all incredibly important aspects of this responsibility that we were talking about.
Thank you. Yeah, my question maybe feeds on from this, what you were raising about crediting and this reality of your students and me being able to read things in English. I wondered if you could comment on this other condition of the contemporary art world that means friendship becomes a certain kind of currency in the ecology or economy in which we work, and what the sort of what the possibilities might be for taking friendship as a deeper model for the making or the working within institutions and the kind of infrastructures that Zeynep was raising. Because on the one hand, it feels kind of like a vehicle for working, like our personal and working lives become very blurred, and so friendship is sort of a natural part of how we tend to work, but the politics of that can be unclear. And yet it seems in your work that it also offers a certain meaty, rigorous way of thinking about how we might form collectivities that really do something. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I'll say I have something very small, short to say about it. The reason I talked about infrastructures is if you build this infrastructure and a network of interlocutors and then you have to move, that doesn't move with you. And an organism, a context by itself is very heavy because it's something that's intricate that you build over a period of time. And then if you want to move it, how does it move? All of those bodies that were moving around in the last couple of days in these performances, you can't move them take it over. It just is very heavy. So that's the comment that I wanted to make about that. Yeah. Which didn't have a lot to do with what you were saying, but that's where my mind went to. So.
And something that this question makes me think of is that the importance of reclaiming friendship as an essentially political relationship, right? It's not friendship, or again, I'm not an expert on friendship. I have very good friends, like most people in this room, but I'm not an expert on friendship. But I know it's not this lovey-dovey hippie thing, right? There's not just inherently positive aspects to friendship. Some of the friendships I discussed, I hope, come out in their problematics. The fact that alliances that we make all the time have a politics which might be deeply problematic, right? So, Joseph Albers is Bayer's friend, and he's basically adding to Bayer's archive the Nazi material. That's a pretty tough form of friendship, right? But I think inherently it has ethics and a politics that I think is important. I know that the sort of friendship conversation can either go towards the sort of cliquiness of the art world, or this inherently redemptive thing. But I think it's important to remember that friendship, we don't just befriend people, we also befriend issues. When you're working on a subject, you have to ally yourself with it. It means you're partaking in talking about this writing or this person or this issue and somehow making it important in your life, you know, like an alliance that can last an entire lifetime without necessarily having any answers on the other side. You know, there was this excellent performance on mollusks that I hope most of you have seen. I would say that's a form of befriending of mollusks that I have never seen before, will probably never see again. It's quite impressive.
Yeah, and can I paraphrase you there? In the essay you say, just because you said that I'm not an expert on friendship, but in the essay you talk about how friendship for you is an extension of support systems that you've been talking about, and that's like how it came about also. Just
in the conditions of work, I think it's important to name friendship as another form of support that we all need.
Do you want to say any last words? Because I think we have to slowly wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you.